Let me do a quick reality check for me. I'm just curious about some names. How many of you, just a show of hands, I can see all of you. How many of you have heard of Walter Cronkite? Okay, everyone. Huntley Brinkley? Chet Huntley, David Brinkley? No? Okay, one. Cool. Peter Jennings? Okay, all of you. I work for PJ. Well, Ed Murrow. Edward R. Murrow. Few of you. Okay, very cool. Well, what I wanted to sort of speak about today is, I know that you've spent part of the weekend learning tools and techniques and skills, which is, of course, terrific. But you're actually also about to enter into I hope for each of you, a phenomenal year as editors, where tools are one thing, but quite frankly, how you use them, how you become leaders, is a completely separate piece of business. Because not only do you have the power of being an editor, but you also have the responsibility and opportunity, really, of leadership, which is very different. You don't have to do this math, but listen to these numbers for just a moment. In 1975, the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite got about 24 million people to watch, viewers every night. 24 million. The NBC News had about 22 million, and the ABC News had about 18 million. So this is about, let's do some quick math, just over 60 million people watched the evening news out of a total population of about 212 million. Pretty impressive. If you look at it those ways, about 10% or more of the population was tuned into Walter Cronkite every night. 10% of all Americans were watching Cronkite. If you compare that to numbers today, Brian Williams last night was probably lucky to get 9 million. Diane Sawyer probably was in the 7 range. And Katie Couric was probably in the high 5s, doing some quick math. That's about 21 or so, I think, out of a population of 308 million. Look at the difference. Barely as many people in total last night watched an evening newscast as compared to watched Cronkite. They were rock stars. They commanded that kind of attention. And they had this reputation within America as people you could turn to in any kind of emergency. So, for instance, when Cronkite was reporting the death of JFK, the viewership that day was astronomical, and people were looking to him. He was known as Uncle Walter. His brand was the most trusted man in America. In the early 1970s, he went to Vietnam at a time when there was growing unhappiness about the war, and he did a series of pieces, one of which called for the U.S. pretty much to start thinking about getting out of the war in Vietnam. And then President Johnson was quoted as saying, when he had lost Cronkite, he had lost the war, he had lost the American people. No one today has that kind of power or prominence in the media. But in its day, these folk really were the dominant drivers of news, of public information, of our understanding about news, at least in the electronic arena. So the question becomes, what makes a brand? How did he get that way? Because if you extrapolate that out, the question I'm really going to try to annoy you with is, what's your brand? And it's more than whether you prefer Coke over Pepsi or Nike or whatever. What's your brand? How would you want to be known? How would you want to have your reputation assessed? Not just as an editor, but what kind of editor? What kind of leader, both within the paper itself, but in the school community? And if you take that one step further, this really isn't just about you as editors, but it's you as individuals. It even applies to your college applications and your college experiences and your life experiences. So the question becomes, what was Cronkite's brand? How did he get it? And is there anything for you all to learn in comparison or in extrapolating that out? I mean, I think one of the things that's happened in the last umpteen years, couple of generations, is that we've all taught to be We've all been taught to be collaborators. We've all been taught to be accommodating, conciliatory. I know that when my kids were in elementary school, they were always taught to have conflict resolution. Or told, oh, there's no I in team. We've got to be team players. In the media world, in the real work world, being a leader is about taking a stand. Being a leader, like Cronkite, is about setting the tone, and by sheer will, at times, bringing everyone else along with you. When you talk about Cronkite, we often talk about him being the most trusted man in America. If you were to ask for adjectives or descriptives about him, probably would say paternal, reassuring. He set the tone for how stories would be heard based on the way he delivered them. Some of the links that I've shared with you include his reporting on the death of President Kennedy, his reporting on the lunar landing of the Apollo spacecraft. At one point, he was a big space buff. But just after the Apollo lunar lander touched down, you see Cronkite in this rather uncustomary but very personal moment. He takes off his glasses, and he's almost losing it. He's totally overwhelmed by the emotion. He wasn't afraid to show that emotion. He showed it on a number of occasions. If he smiled at the end of a piece or at the end of the show after a reporter's story, that reporter immediately basked in the warmth and the appreciation that Walter liked the story. In point of fact, he was cold, he was ruthless, he was judgmental at many times. He was very, very tough on people around him because he knew that as the managing editor, and he was the first managing editor of any network newscast. Now, every anchorman wants to be the managing editor because no doubt that conveys their importance. Walter was the first one to do it. Walter was the first one to demand it and get it. Walter was the first personality who also was managing editor. For those of you who don't know, he was not among the early pick of CBS. He was not one of Ed Murrow's boys, Ed Murrow being the great CBS war correspondent who went off to Europe and hired a number of newspaper reporters, and they became the stock in trade of the CBS radio network at a time, of course, during World War II. There wasn't television the way we know it now at all. It was still very experimental. Cronkite wasn't one of Murrow's boys. He was a UPI reporter. And in some ways, he felt inferior to the prominence of the Ed Murrow team, though in point of fact, over time, he actually exceeded all of those. Within CBS, okay, so he was known outside as Uncle Walter, the most trusted man in America. Inside CBS, he was known as Old Iron Pants. How did he get that name?